Afternoon, everybody. Mr. Arnke with you for CCT250, Network Vulnerabilities 1. We're going to be getting into the Certified Ethical Hacker book today. So this is going to be Module 1, Introduction to Ethical Hacking. We're going to talk about 7 major objectives today. We're going to look at the elements of information security, which we've talked about before in a couple of other classes, but we need a little refresher. We're going to look at some information security attacks as well as information warfare. We're going to look at the CKC, also known as the cyber kill chain, the methodology, the TTPs and IOCs that we use in that framework. We're going to look at some hacking concepts, types, and phases. We're going to explain ethical hacking concepts and scope. And then we're going to look at some InfoSec controls, so things like defense in depth, risk management, cyber threat intel, threat models, incident management process, and AI and machine learning. Last but not least for today, we'll look at information security laws and standards. So we'll look at things like SARbox and HIPAA, things like that. So let's hop into the overview first. Information security is the safeguarding of systems that use, store, and transmit information and the data itself. So we're protecting the systems and the data from unauthorized access, disclosure, alteration, and destruction. It is also considered to be the state of well-being of information and infrastructure in which possibilities of theft, tampering, or disruption of information and services is kept low or tolerable. So a lot of fancy language to say we're going to protect the infrastructure devices as well as the data. We're going to protect our end devices and our switches and routers and what have you, as well as the data that's being sent. We've got 5 primary tenets of information security that we talk about. Now, most of the time people bring up the big 3, the triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But here, we're also going to add the other 2, authenticity and non-repudiation. Confidentiality is the assurance that information is only accessible to people who are authorized to access it. So we use things like data classification, encryption, and proper equipment disposal to make sure that this is the case. Integrity is just making sure that the data that it says is there, the data that's advertised, is the data that's delivered. So it's trustworthiness in the prevention of improper and unauthorized changes. So to this end, we use things like checksums and physical and logical access controls. Availability makes sure that things are available when required. If we say that between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. you're going to be able to access this particular system, we should make sure that that system is available. A lot of sites focus pretty heavily on uptime, making sure that their resources are available as much as possible. So information delivery, storage, and processing systems fall under this umbrella. So we use things like disk arrays. So we use RAID and more fault tolerance-based systems, as well as actual backups in order to be able to restore quickly. Because remember, RAID is not a backup. Antivirus and anti-malware software, DDoS prevention systems, all of these are considered to enhance availability. Authenticity. This is a characteristic that ensures the quality of being genuine, making sure that something is legitimate. So biometrics, smart cards, digital certificates, things that are difficult to dispute, which leads us to topic number 5, non-repudiation. To repudiate something means to say that you're denying it, that you're not taking responsibility for something, whether it was you or not. Repudiation is basically saying, no, that wasn't me. So non-repudiation, the countermeasure to this, means that senders cannot deny sending, nor can recipients deny receipt. So things like digital signatures, blockchain ledgers, these are meant to ensure that if a transaction is processed in a particular way, that we have a paper trail, if you will. And of course, in a digital environment, paper trail is just a metaphor. So let's take a look at some InfoSec attacks as well as information warfare. The motivation, goal, and objective of an information security attack. An attack is 3 main components: motive, method, and vulnerability. A motive is a goal or objective, so we've got kind of a list of synonyms up here in the title bar. It originates from an idea that the target system contains or processes something valuable. So it may be that this particular system will disrupt a business's ability to do what it does. It breaks continuity, exacting revenge, damaging reputation. This is usually from the saboteur category. State actor objectives, which can be fairly large. You know, if there's a company that provides a particular resource that is considered essential to a government that is hostile to that may be willing to say, hey, let's go ahead and attack this particular producer. Disruption to create chaos and fear, that is cyber terrorism, using things to try and make life seem a bit more hectic. I'm sure you'll remember the ransomware attack on one of the oil pipelines that caused the buying panic for gas for a little while. That would be an example of disruption to create chaos and fear. They were ransoming for Bitcoin. Curiosity, yeah, idle curiosity can be a motive. Religion, ethical or political beliefs, this can sometimes be part of hacktivism. Ransom or financial gain, of course, and then data manipulation, just, to try and change a particular data set to meet someone's needs or criteria. The motive is often dependent on an attacker's state of mind, how they look at a particular task or how they look at a particular objective can be very telling when we see what the outcome of that particular motive is. Once a goal is determined, an attacker can employ various tools, techniques, and methods to exploit a vulnerable system. Now, the IETF, or Internet Engineering Task Force, defines 5 security attack categories: passive, active, close-in, insider, and distribution. So, in passive attack, we have interception and monitoring. We're not really messing with anything, it's all observation. It's very difficult to detect this kind of intrusion. It involves things like just footprinting, traffic sniffing, traffic analysis, and anything that's weakly encrypted being decrypted. So generally that's not something that's going to show up on most radars. The reason being is that a lot of the stuff that goes on looks very close to normal traffic. So if we start blocking stuff that looks like normal traffic, we're going to block a lot of things. Not necessarily good for business continuity. Active attacks tamper with data or disrupt communications or services between systems. So this is a long list, so bear with me. Denial of service, so DOS, malware, information modification, spoofing, replay attacks, password attacks, hijacks, man-in-the-middle, DNS and ARP poisoning, firewall and IDS attacks, profiling, ACE attacks, that's arbitrary code execution, privilege escalation, backdoor usage, crypto attacks, and that's crypto as in cryptography, not as in cryptocurrency. SQL injection, cross-site scripting, that's what XSS stands for, directory traversal, and app and OS exploits. So there's a lot of different things that can be manipulated here that could allow disruption of this type. Close-in attacks require close physical proximity. This is going to be to gather or modify info or disrupt access. Usually, it's not necessarily going to be modifying or disrupting anything unless it's a matter of like somebody leaves something on a post-it note and they take the note and they write something else on it or similar. Generally, this is going to be more of the social engineering stuff. Eavesdropping, shoulder surfing, dumpster diving, fake surveys, things like that. Just trying to get information from people or from locations that are easy to simply observe. Now, this is kind of weird because some people feel that that falls into the passive category, but you are directly interacting with data custodians at that point. So it does fall into the active category, but it's requiring specifically that we are physically close to a particular data source. Insider attacks, these are done by trusted persons who have physical access to critical assets. An attacker uses privileged access to break the rules or cause a threat. This can be difficult to figure out. Some examples here: wiretaps, a little bit old school. That is definitely more of something that you would have seen during like the Clinton presidency up through like Bush 2, where a lot of people were using landlines. Now, wiretapping is a little bit different. Wiretaps are going to be placed usually by government agencies, because the FCC is able to impose certain sanctions on telecoms. If you were on a landline, the junction box outside of your house that the telephone line connects to before it goes to the street could be intruded upon fairly easily. Physical theft, being able to take documents or physical objects or IP that would, delay a certain project or possibly break an NDA that would cause undue damage to competition. Social engineering. So again, we see that social engineering shows up in both close-in as well as insider. Social engineering just means you've already got some leverage because you are in some way, shape, or form in the know. If you are if you're an IT technician and you use known items about people to allow social engineering to be more effective, that is an insider attack that also falls into the close-in category. So there are some bleeds between the two. Data theft and spoiling, pod slurping, which is a kind of a weird one. Talk about that in a later chapter. Planting keyloggers, malware, backdoors, distribution. This is where attackers are going to mess with stuff prior to installation. So this can occur either at the source or in transit. So a big one that we ran into a couple of years ago was people who would come from states that have very authoritarian controls over external communications. Some state actors would actually come into the US and buy iPhones and other high-end smartphones and then have them loaded with custom firmware that would then be able to be easily manipulated by the government. So kind of the inverse of the coin of where Apple absolutely refused to allow the government to install a modified version of the operating system after the San Bernardino attacks. This is instead the government is saying, well, we're not going to require any sort of pretext for this. We're going to go ahead and just buy these devices, and we're going to go ahead and modify them so that way, as they go into the black market, we have these devices that are already custom designed for us to be able to manipulate. Hacked firmware is generally how that happens. Backdoors sometimes are how that works. Leaving in some kind of administrative account that can be accessed remotely very easily. Modification during production. If somebody were to put Clipper chips into phones again or something similar, as opposed to going through like Prism or Epsilon or one of the programs that does monitoring directly through data centers and through telecom primary junctions. And the modification during distribution is just where somebody has a malware that is able to affect a device. If somebody were to put out a let's say you had like an old Cisco or Linux based router that had licensing on it for the new update, and you don't want to pay for the licensing fee, so it's like, okay, well, let me go ahead and get one that circumvents that. And somebody has one that has some custom kernel code that says, okay, we're not going to have that OS check, or that we're not going to be able to ping home or things like that. And what's going to happen at that point is that modified code probably has a couple of white rabbit objects in it, things that are just kind of tucked off to the side that will activate at a particular time, like a logic bomb or something similar. Information warfare. InfoWar refers to the use of communication and information tech, or information and communication tech, to use the correct acronym ICT, for competitive advantage. So things like viruses, worms, trojans, logic bombs, penetration exploits. And it falls into two big categories and then 7 smaller ones. Defensive and offensive information war. Defensive deals with actions and defense strategy. Offensive deals with attacks and targeting of assets, as you might have guessed. Martin C. Libicki, probably one of the preeminent people in the world of InfoWar, one of the big pundits for how InfoWar has grown over time, divides InfoWar into 7 primary categories. What we call C2, which is command and control, intelligence-based InfoWar, electronic, psychological, hacker, economic, and cyber warfare based. So the thing about Libicki that's really impressive to me is that his background in terms of his academia has virtually nothing to do with computers. It's all about, if you look on the right, he has a bachelor's in mathematics from MIT, not bad, a master's in city planning, and a PhD in economics. So it is the psychology, the mental underpinnings of how these things are constructed, how these attacks should work, that really drive his assessments. And he is a track 2 diplomat on cybersecurity between the US and China. And again, because he's looking at the fundamentals, he's looking at the underpinnings of these things rather than specific technology-based items. Now, if you guys have had me in class before, especially if you take hardware software with me, you know that one of the biggest things I'll tell you is learn the fundamentals, because the details will change. You can memorize all kinds of stuff about the new Intels that come out, or AMD's got this new chipset coming and it does this, da da da. If you understand the fundamentals of how these things work, you can much more easily file that into your brain without having to do a lot of rote memorization, because the fundamentals never change. It's the little nitpicky details. And of course, the nitpicky details are important, but we can automate a lot of them. So to break Libicki's category system down a little bit further, let's take a look at them one at a time. Command and control warfare refers to the impact that an attacker possesses over a compromised system or network. How much strength can they pivot from on a controlled server that has a C2 exploit. Intelligence-based info war is sensor-based, observational, if you will, and it directly corrupts technological systems. Electronic uses radio electronic and cryptographic techniques to break down communication, and it will employ disruption of not only logical means of transmission, which is just messing with the encoding, but physical disruption as well, so using things like RF jammers, things like that. Psychological information warfare demoralizes adversaries and implements things like propaganda, terror, and media manipulation in order to manipulate the opinions of the public or of the enemy in question. Hacker information warfare can vary, as you can imagine. This can involve things like shutdowns, data errors and theft, system theft, surveillance, false messages, red herrings. This generally is going to employ things like logic bombs, trojans, sniffers, and viruses. So most of your common malware is going to fall into that primary category. Economic info war deals with blocking information to mess with economic infrastructure. So basically, if a government is unable to make accurate or shrewd decisions about a trade agreement or something similar by means of items that have been blocked from them, that could kind of fall into the economic category. The last and broadest category, cyber warfare, info war, is the use of systems against online personas. And we're 20 years into the first, this century, right? So we're a fifth of the way in. And something that we've seen is a really big transition from the idea of a person as an individual to a person as their public face. The way that we see them, there's this weird parasocial relationship that starts to form. You see it with celebrities that interact with people through Reddit AMAs or through threads on Twitter. Social media has really changed how we interact with people that we perceive to be quote-unquote celebrities. These attacks can often be semantic. So remember that the difference between semantics and syntax is syntax deals with the actual structure or facts of a statement, whereas semantics will use connotation, the meaning, in order to try and gain ground. Information terrorism is sometimes going to be synonymized with a quiet system takeover with the illusion of normal operation. So we can essentially be controlling information at that point rather than overtly manipulating it through slander or libel or whatever avenue tends to be taken against that persona. Another term that Libicki popularized was simula warfare. So this is where we have a war system that is, it's not necessarily like we're playing at war, it's we are aggrandizing a potential threat in order to make it seem more dangerous. We're simulating aspects, we're kind of inflating things in the assets of a particular combat system. Cyber kill chain methodology, TTPs, and IOCs. So the CKC, we're gonna have a lot of acronyms in this class. The cyber kill chain is a 7-phase framework developed to secure cyberspace. Depending on who you talk to, people will say, you can't secure cyberspace. Nobody owns the net. It's too big. But again, it's all about deterrence, right? It's based on the concept of military kill chains, which is where we can aid understanding at each stage of an attack. So we can find places at which we can break this chain in order to stop adversaries from being able to gain further advantage. It's going to provide clear insight into attack strategy so various levels of control can be applied effectively. And it aims to actively enhance intrusion detection and response. So in some cases, it's not necessarily going to be the response part. It may just be that we're focusing on the detection. Because in some cases, being able to observe an attacker before they go through a particular phase of their attack sequence may allow us to gain greater insight into what's going on. So the 7 phases are reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and then we go to work on the objectives. So follow this with me. If we have, something dangerous, like we're using a weapon or something else, like, we have a piece of custom malware, we need to be able to figure out what is the avenue by which we're going to send this in. We have this weaponized product. We're going to deliver it by some means. We may have an email attachment, or we may have an injection. We may have a drive-by download setup. We may do like a watering hole attack to where we try and draw people in so that they download the malware and then introduce it into the system, and then we can bootstrap it. Once it's in place, then we can exploit whatever the hole may be, get the installation done. That allows us to preserve and prolong our access, so maintaining access is a big part of that. Then we get to the command and control portion, which is where we're able to take over the victim's system to make it do what we want it to do. And once we have control, and we know that we have probably multiple avenues to regain control in case we get kicked out of one, we can then carry out step 7, which is our actions on objectives. So you can see here these phases are kind of broken up a little bit differently than what I just described, but this is a nice little flashcard to help you kind of remember how this works. Tactics, techniques, and procedures. These are TTPs. Excuse me. Tactics are how threat agents work over phases. So, threat agent is somebody who is potentially going to be able to produce a given outcome. So in the phases of the CKC, they behave in different ways. In order to carry out weaponization or recon or whatever else, they can have these different fingerprints, if you will. So recon, privilege escalation, initial exploit, the type of entry point they use, the number of entry points they try and use, what their persistence measures are, how they're trying to hold on to access, the cover up, etc. Some threat actors and threat actor groups will depend solely on web-based info. So they'll have stuff that they can pull from web searches or crawls. Some of them will actually have tools where they can pull additional info through penetration. So if you go to like Maltego or things like that. Others will leverage social engineering on a different level, trying to gain information based on other observations that are possible, either physically or digitally. And then tags often are found to depend on static tactics, meaning that they have a trick that works and that's what they put into play, especially if they have a lot of stuff that's automated. They will have, okay, phase 1 and phase 2 involve a little bit of the human touch, but once we get past that, everything up until the actual goal phase is going to be automated. Another method would be review of the attack setup and tools that they use. So where we have these static tactics, if they have a C2 server that is kind of a kind of a standalone, maybe they have a server that they've rented space on that's in the middle of like Latvia or some third-party country that has no affiliation with either of the two involved in the combat. That can be a potential clue to what's going on. If they have a server that is being manipulated as part of a botnet, that is also going to be kind of telling. Zero-day exploits, pre-made tools versus custom tools. We know that if we're dealing with pre-made tools, we're probably dealing with someone for whom the computer knowledge necessary to perform the hack is not second nature, so that way, if they're using pre-mades, it's more important for them to have a previously tested utility and to be able to best use their time. So that means that their computer skills are probably a little bit lower. We want to be careful, though. We don't want to assume that they're considered to be low computer skilled, like script kiddies and things like that. But that may be something that can help us to identify where a future attack may lead, what other exploits they may try and put into play. The technique is the methodology, how they put these things into play, the initial exploit, the C2 setup and upkeep, because remember, you have to maintain control. Systems generally don't like being deformed from their original purpose. Infrastructure access, cover up. Covering your tracks is entirely automated, so we want to make sure that we know that once the actions are done, there's usually a cleanup tool that you can just run at that point, but you want to make sure that it's robust. So again, that's where the whole pre-made versus custom argument falls back in. At each lifecycle stage, we can determine a lot about the techniques that are being used. So stage 1 is recon, so we don't really need a lot of tech tools. A lot of that stuff is just somebody sitting at a terminal and searching stuff up on a web browser. Not a whole lot that's actually considered to be active attacking. Mid-stage deals with our design flaws, misconfig, exploits. How are we getting in? How are we sustaining access? Once we get to the end stage, this is all going to be network tech and crypto, and then we do our cleanup. After we aggregate the information from a particular attack, whether it was successful or not, we can start to establish a profile about a particular organization, especially if they have a lot of attacks that are not successful and we see different tools being used as substitutions. We can get an idea of what their logic is. And I think that's something that's important to look at when we talk about guys like Martin Libicki, is that if you look at the logic of how something is done, the tools that are involved are derivative of that logic. So that means that the logic is the key aspect to the analysis. Procedures are organizational approaches followed by TAs to launch attacks. So the number of steps that are going to be involved here will differ depending on the objectives as well as the group involved. Adversary Behavioral Identification, ABI. This involves identifying common methods used by an adversary to launch attacks. This technique gives network defense professionals insight into upcoming threats. So when we talked a little bit ago about identifying things by means of aggregate data, figuring out what they do that is considered to be not necessarily unique to them, but like a signature almost. So adversarial behaviors that are used for this kind of analysis would be things like internal reconnaissance, how they use PowerShell, if they use PowerShell, what the syntax looks like for their different structured queries, unspecified proxy activities, involvement with CLI. We know CLI, of course, as being the command line interface rather than using a GUI. PowerShell, of course, is a CLI, but if they use CLI for things like just using the command prompt, or if they're on Linux, if they use terminal, if they're on Mac, they use bash. A web shell, that can also be kind of telling, because if they're going through a web shell, that may mean a little bit more, they're dependent more on remote access through a compromised portal. Use of DNS tunneling, how they run their command and control servers, how they do their data staging, and if they have an HTTP-based user agent in order to maintain position. IOC, or indicator of compromise, is an internal clue, forensic artifact, or data that could indicate potential malicious activity. I do want to emphasize potential there. IOCs they're salad dressing, really. They're not considered intel by themselves, but during recon, they can enhance existing intel by corroboration. They're good data points, essentially, to help enhance reconnaissance. Security has to perform continuous monitoring of IOCs in order to respond effectively to threats. And understanding IOCs helps teams to be able to quickly ID and respond to threats. Now, in the table here on the right, I've given you 4 categories. Each has a description and each has a set of examples. So just from top to bottom. So I'm going to go from left to right in each main item. Email is used to send malicious data to a target. That can be an indicator of compromise. So We can examine here the sender's email address, what's the subject, what's the attachment, what's the encoding, things like that. For a network IOC, these are things that will often be used for C2 servers, malware delivery, identifying an operating system, so things like URLs, FQDNs, and IP addresses, so network-based identifiers. Host-based IOCs can be found by analysis of an infected internal system. So if we quarantine a system, before we purge it, we can actually examine it in order to find a couple of different methods by which compromise could be carried out. Things like file names that have been changed from an original pattern, hashes, registry keys, DLLs, and mutex. Mutex we'll definitely talk about later on as well. Behavioral IOCs deal with identifying specific behavior related to malicious activities. So a document that runs a PS script, macros, remote code execution. So, what behavior triggers X, Y, or Z? That's what we're talking about here. Now we're into subsection 4, talking about concepts, types, and phases of hacking. A lot of people get kind of confused about hacking. For some reason, they think of hacking as being this thing where you sit there and you, rattle on the keys, and tons of code is flying by your eyes, and that's really, excuse me, that's so comedically far away from what hacking really is. As you go through the course, you're going to see that yourself, especially when you start playing with the labs. Hacking, in its simplest form, is exploiting vulnerabilities and controls to gain inappropriate or unauthorized access to a system's resources. We are modifying an aspect of the system or application to exceed the intent of the creator. As the kids might say, we're being a little bit extra. While hacking can be used ethically in order to test boundaries and figure out where a particular vulnerability may arise within a particular company's infrastructure, it can also lead to loss for organizations and individuals. So that means that hacking traditionally has to be used as an offensive tool in the pursuit of defense. It's kind of strange, kind of the whole the paradox of those who desire peace must prepare for war kind of thing. Well, hacking falls into that category. Hackers usually possess one or more of the following attributes. The prodigy. Excellent computer skills, can create and explore their own hardware and software. They have a very strong intuitive understanding of how computer software works, how computer software engages as it communicates between the hardware and back, how machine code and assembly code may transition, how memory exploits can be used, etc. Hobbyists, these are going to be guys and girls who view hacking as a challenge. This is something that's like, it gets the old creative juices flowing. Now, they may also be able to possess more than one of these characteristics, so just remember, you can have somebody who is a hobbyist who is also very good at what they do in terms of computer skills. And then you have the maverick. This is someone who is seeking knowledge and exploration legally or otherwise. They are, in their minds anyway, patrolling the wild west of technology. They're trying to find things out, trying to test out potential exploits. So there's a little bit of curiosity in the maverick. There's a little bit of skill, sometimes more than a little bit. But again, it's kind of like, I'm either so good at this that it's almost effortless for me to create these hacking opportunities. The hobbyist is trying to just kind of keep themselves occupied, and the maverick is, in their mind, trailblazing. And any of these can be handled with either malicious or benign intent and can very easily compromise highly sensitive data. So that is why we have classes like this, so we can make sure that we express to you as students that hacking is a very dangerous tool. And it's very accessible, especially in the generational sense, to where we have people who are growing up with technology that is far beyond even what I saw when I was younger, and I consider myself to be fairly adept. So this means in order to stay on top of the field, stay on top of my job as part of the ethical hacking community, I have to continue to pursue that knowledge throughout the entirety of my career, throughout the entirety of my life, really. And thankfully, because I very much enjoy what I do, that's not a difficult proposition. Now, there are dozens of different classes that somebody may want to put themselves in, but the powers that be in the tech world have kind of boiled it down to about 8. We could probably combine a couple of these if we really wanted to, but I think this is a pretty good setup. First up, we'll deal with the hats: black hats, white hats, and gray hats. Black hats are extraordinarily skilled. They can be malicious or destructive and are often also called crackers because they are trying to crack the system like a nut. And in certain cases, they will sledgehammer it like a nut. White hats are able to do almost all the same things that black hats are. Well, let me remove the almost. They can do all the same stuff. It's just that their motivation is different. They use their skills for defensive purposes. The system owner gives them permission to do these things. They have what are called rules of engagement, so that way they can make sure that they're following the correct procedure and making sure they're not violating any of the orders of agreement that are present between themselves and the system owner during their testing or their exploration. They are sometimes also called security analysts. Gray hats can work both offensively and defensively, so gray hats tend to fall between, as you might imagine, gray falling between black and white. Suicide hackers. These are hackers that aim to bring down critical infrastructure for some cause. They can be chaotic. They can be, left, right, or center leaning. Doesn't really seem to make any difference there. They exist in all stripes. They're unbothered by jail or any other punishment because they feel the cause for which they are carrying out this particular operation is well worth it. Script kiddies, I mentioned them a little bit earlier when we were talking about pre-made versus custom toolkits. Unskilled hackers that use previously developed scripts, apps, and tools. So this is where a more competent hacker could very easily sell a toolkit that they have fabricated themselves and be able to reap some of the benefits. If you sell a toolkit to somebody, you can claim a little bit more ignorance to where it's just like, oh no, this is just for testing. I didn't actually believe anybody would do this thing, X, Y, or Z. So script kiddies are sometimes called posers because they're not really hackers other than the fact that they know how to follow on-screen instructions and press the button. Cyber terrorists, they're widely skilled, motivated by religion, politics, etc. to create fear and disruption. State hackers, these are government employed, usually pretty skilled. They often have the best toys because state governments have the ability to maintain said toys. They penetrate and damage foreign systems, gaining top secret intelligence as they go. So this is how different countries will try and gain competitive advantage one over the other by hacking one another, just as you might imagine the name implies. Hacktivist is not terribly far from cyber terrorist, and this is something I like to point out. I'm a fairly liberal person myself in terms of social justice and things like that. But something I want to point out is that no cause gives one the right to break the law. So there are always going to be consequences. So a hacktivist is someone who promotes a political agenda by hacking, usually by defacement or takedowns or things like that. So they are causing loss to a system motivated by politics. So if we look over here at cyber terrorists just to the left, motivated by politics to cause disruption, maybe not necessarily fear, but disruption, hacktivists and cyber terrorists are essentially the same thing. And what it comes down to is the victors write history. The people who have gained whatever measure of power they feel is their appropriate level will then be able to say, aha, we are the victors, so of course we're the freedom fighters rather than the dangerous insurgents. Okay, so we always have to remember that some of this comes with a big heap and help and a bias poured over the top of it. So the reconnaissance in hacking is going to fall into two main categories. It's a preparatory phase where we try and find more information about a target prior to the attack. So maybe a way to get back in once we know more about the target, or multiple methods of access, different people that should be targeted for social engineering, etc. Passive recon is finding info without direct contact, so things like news releases, public records, stuff that is not going to, trigger any kind of measure of observation by the target in question. They're not going to be aware of this. Active recon means that we're going to be direct involved by any means. So it could be talking to a person who works for the company, either face-to-face or via telephone, phishing via email, dumpster diving, trying to kind of, scap up what you can from, calendars that were thrown away or old hard drives, memorandums, things like that. Stuff that escaped the shredder. It's an important aspect of when you work for a business. The more documents that you can have shredded to prevent their recovery, the better off you're probably likely to be. The scanning phase, which is the next one after recon, is going to fall into 3 categories, and this is where we have the pre-attack, where we're going to go ahead and scan the network for specific information based on what we figured out in the recon step. We're going to do a port scan, so we're going to try and figure out what ports are listening, what applications may be running, what operating systems are running, and that is going to transition smoothly into extracting info. So that's pulling data from live machines. So we know things that are active on the network. We're going to try and probe them and see what we can get as a response. And in certain cases, we can actually use the lack of a response to indicate a particular behavior. If it's a filtered port, that's different than a closed port versus an open port, so we can try and start building an idea of what we're actually getting. Gaining and maintaining access, phase 3. Gaining access is the point where the attacker cracks the target's defenses, and now they're able to get in and start manipulating things as if they had proper control, rather than this contrived stuff. This is possible at the operating system level, application level, or the network level. So we can crack passwords, of course. Passwords are probably the least helpful in terms of credentials that help us to maintain security. Using buffer overflow attacks, we're trying to manipulate memory. Denial of service attacks, session hijacks, trying to get to gateway of last resort kind of thing. Escalation of privilege is where we take a given access level. Let's say that we log in as just a standard user. Maybe we have an old set of credentials or something similar. And then we can increase the access level of that particular profile in order to move up towards working on intermediate systems and obtaining complete control. Sometimes people will call this, climbing the mountain or pivoting. That's a term that'll come up quite a bit, trying to move from one system to another using existing access credentials in order to try and gain higher and higher levels. Maintaining access on the other side is where attackers will try and make sure that once the system is compromised, that they always have a way back in. So we can do this with backdoors, we can do this with rootkits, we can do this with Trojans, basically being able to insert or modify pieces of code to be able to make sure that there is a way back in. Attackers can upload, download, manipulate system data, applications, and configuration, and then the cracked system can be used to attack other systems. So you go from a point of single entry, multiple entries, maintained access, full control, and then we can spread from system to system. Once we've gotten in and we've done whatever it is we desire to do as hackers, we then need to go ahead and clear out what our actions were, and by extension, our identity. Now, we may wish to prolong our access or leave a known entry point open, but logs or other methodologies for observing activities on a particular system, those are things that we don't necessarily want to leave behind. So we will want to go in and modify things like server logs, system logs, as well as application logs. So this is where, of course, we have automated systems that often do this cleanup, but it also helps to know, given this particular network, what is the order of operations? Where are logs being sent? What is being logged? Is it automatically passing through something like an IDS or an IPS? Is there a UTM or SIEM being involved that will give us away really quickly? Let's look at 1.5, concepts and scope. We talked about what hacking is in general, but what I want you guys to focus on for this class is the concept of ethical hacking. It's the same as conventional hacking, but we have permission and we have a sense of duty to the companies that are paying us to do this work, to do this testing and observation. Instead of damaging a system, we're going to focus on identifying and verifying vulnerabilities, and then providing information to help remediate this exploit or this vulnerability or whatever it is, so that we can enhance system security. So if we run into something where we're like, you've got this old version of Apache running, and if somebody sends, a particular, get or post query that's crafted in a particular way, they can gain mid-range access, which they could then pivot upwards, kind of things like that. This discipline is necessary because it allows for counterattacking and prevention through anticipation. We have seen the enemy and he is us, kind of thing. And that's something we want to remember, is that we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the people on the other end of the hacking game, the people who are in black hats, if you will, are people just like us, usually with the same level of training, same level of aptitude. So it's a matter of remembering to think like them whenever we're dealing with trying to prevent or remediate an attack. Why do companies employ ethical hackers? Well, we've got things like intrusion prevention, breach avoidance, vulnerability discovery, customer safety, system strengthening, and enhancement of awareness. You can't fix what you don't know is there, so the awareness piece is a pretty big one. All white and gray hats must be able to think like a black hat in order to be able to match and defeat them. As such, there are 6 primary questions that all ethical hackers must consider. What can an intruder observe? And that's phase 1 and 2 kind of stuff. What impact does the observable data possess? That's 3 and 4. Is the intrusion visible? That's 1 and 5. So we're talking about all 5 phases here of the attack cycle. Are all system components adequately secured? So that means that we look again at phase 1 and 2. What can an intruder actually see? What can they get into? And if they can see it, have we updated the firmware? Have we updated any software that's running on it? Have we made sure that the ports are hardened for network infrastructure materials, things like that? What does adequate protection cost? And we have to remember there's multiple costs involved. There's work, there's time, and there's money. So we have to expend all 3 of those things in order to secure a particular system. And then are current information security measures in compliance with that of legal and industry standards? So not only do we make sure that people can't get in, we also have to make sure that there is a baseline of security that says, hey, this is not going to be a setting that we have left alone that can be easily exploited. We have gone in and made sure that based on, if we work as a company that handles credit cards, we have to make sure we're PCI DSS compliant. One of the big stories a couple of years ago was that Target was not actually meeting PCI DSS compliance. And because they were such a huge company, people just assumed that they were doing so. And then, of course, they get hit with these big breaches all of a sudden, and people are like, oh, turns out they weren't providing the types of protection necessary to make sure that customer confidence was justified. Scope is the range of influence of a particular item. So in this case, we talk about how ethical hacking is crucial to risk assessment, auditing, counter fraud, information security best practices. It helps us to identify risk, and it helps us to highlight opportunities, which means we can reduce the amount of cost as well as the loss potential. Now, as far as the limits are concerned, unless the organization knows what to look for, the experience might not provide a great deal of benefit for employment of an ethical hacker. Ethical hackers can also only test and provide analysis of a system. So we can observe what's there, but an organization must provide and maintain the correct safeguards. So if you've got an old, I'll use the example again of like bad web server software. We're using an old version of Apache that for whatever reason still has a vulnerability to a particular type of attack when crafted using an older version of HTTPS. When that is in place, we have to be aware of, we tell the company, this is what's going on, this is your current position, and then they choose how they behave based on that information. If they do not choose to implement anything or to make changes based on your recommendation, then there's not a whole lot you can do about it. It's not like you can sit there and fix it yourself, because that will entail usually a lot of underlying material that has to be handled by administrators and things that have to be approved financially, things like that. The skill sets that are necessary for good ethical hacking. There's two primary categories, technical and non-technical. Technical skills would be in-depth knowledge of major operating systems, networking concepts, tech, and related apps. Aptitude with technical and security domains would be helpful, and then a high technical knowledge in constructing and deconstructing sophisticated attacks. So being able to find something that's, like a multi-phasic attack or something similar. Non-technical skills would be things like the ability to learn and adapt, having a strong work ethic, good communication skills, as well as an ethical commitment to security and awareness of local, regional, and federal standards and legislation. Now, 1.6 is going to be a little bit dry because it's a lot of legal stuff, but it will kind of help you to understand that there are a lot of things in place that help us to create the security standards by which we operate, so that we're not just kind of sitting there going like, well, I guess this is what we'll include, So information assurance, or IA, which was a primary piece of my master's degree, refers to assurances that information security is correctly in place and maintained. So some attendant processes would be things like developing local policy, process, and guidance. Policy only works well when it's implemented at all levels. So if we have policy at kind of a grassroots local level, then we have mid-range, then we have regional, then we have federal, that kind of stuff tends to be much more helpful because the rules fit into each other like puzzle pieces, and they just kind of snap together and reinforce one another. Designing network and user authentication strategies, making sure that sometimes people like to throw the whole kitchen sink at a problem. Sometimes passwords work just fine. You don't necessarily have to have, multi-factor authentication and an additional token or biometric authentication. Sometimes passwords are okay. Depends on the difficulty of the data that you want to make sure is staying protected. But that requires that technical staff be sitting there at each level and say, hey, this is the type of authentication strategy we should employ. We need to have, a cipher lock on this door. We need to have an armed security personnel person sitting here. We need to have multi-factor authentication for this particular online service. It requires good analysis. Identifying vulnerabilities and threats, and this is going to be kind of an ever-changing platform. Identifying problem and resource requirements. It's easy to say, well, how do we fix it? And it's like, well, let's just overhaul all the equipment that we have, and it'll only cost us $150,000. Well, the company only makes like $60,000 a year, so we're burning 2.5 years profits to try and secure something, and then the likelihood is in another 2 years, by the time we've caught up, we may still have a flaw. So how can we remediate in a way that's maybe a little bit more specific and a little bit less costly? Just instead of throwing money at it, how do we find a solution that's more accessible? That's another good part of information assurance. Creating plans for identified resource requirements, applying the appropriate IA controls, so not only designing them, but making sure that they are applied and maintained. Performing certification and accreditation, so making sure that people are not only aware of policies, but people who are in positions of authority have the correct certification, so they've gone through the same training. They know what the different steps are in order to implement X, Y, or Z procedures, whatever it is that's devised as part of the policy process. And then providing IA training. It's kind of hard to certify somebody or give them an accreditation if we don't have the training. It's important to be able to, spread the knowledge around. This is part of what's called a security aware culture, to where you have a group that is at base level significantly aware of what security aspects exist to help not only protect them as employees, the company as a whole, our clients and customers, making sure that information is not being treated foolishly without good discipline and restraint. Defense in depth. Now, this is a strategy where several protective layers are placed throughout a system. This is one of my favorites. The idea is if we have a break at one layer, we're only going to allow somebody to make it to the next layer, which means that they have to go and burrow through that one and that one and that one. Now, we can have multiple physical layers, but it's also helpful if we look at them in terms of multiple aspects of the network. So, of course, the data being the primary point of protection is all the way at the bottom of the chart here. Applications that interact with that data, they need to be protected. Hosts that interact with the applications, networks that allow the host to access the external resources of an outer network and then being able to pass things around an internal network, the perimeter that they pass through, the physical infrastructure of the building, and then of course policy, procedures, and awareness to deal with the people of it all. You know, if people don't know the rules, if people don't have an awareness of the security requirements of your organization, it is very unlikely that they, on accident, will follow them. So something that I talk to students about that they're, you know, they say makes sense when they hear it, but it's not something that's immediately intuitive, is you have to teach every employee that has access to anything what the rules are. You know, you have to have these little compliance notices and things like that, relative to what their job is, of course. But if you create this security-aware culture, strangely enough, some of the psychology of that will rub off as well as the actual functionality, to where we have an awesome security system, we have layers in place in order to prevent intrusions, and everybody knows it. So you almost get this weird kind of like prom queen syndrome, to where it's like, well, you know, it's going to be too difficult, so I'm never going to ask. You know, it's like they're the prettiest girl in school, so I'm never going to even give it a go. Now, we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that just because we talk a big game, we don't actually need the defense. So it does have to be backed up. Risk and risk management. The degree of uncertainty wherein a system may experience damage. Risks are categorized based on an estimated impact, usually a risk matrix. Risk matrices are factored using three main items: probability, likelihood, and consequence. The probability that something could happen, the likelihood that it will happen, and the consequence if it does happen. Risk management is the process of reducing and mitigating risk to acceptable levels. So risk management then takes on 5 distinct phases. Phase 1 is identification. We need to see what our sources, causes, and consequences are. Assessment allows us to find general risk as well as to estimate the impact. Treatment allows us to select and implement the appropriate controls. Tracking ensures that the controls are effective over time. And review allows us to evaluate a strategy's performance. Now, what you notice for identification and review, the first and last phase, is that it's all about observation. We're trying to see where is the risk coming from, what's the likely consequence, etc. And then once the controls have been put in place, we're still monitoring to say, does this control do what we intended it to do? Does this control give us security? Does this control ameliorate a potential threat? CTI, or cyber threat intelligence, is defined as a collection and analysis process of finding information about threats and adversaries, as well as using that information to find patterns. These patterns will allow us to make knowledgeable decisions for preparation, prevention, and response. Now, CTI helps to identify and mitigate risks by converting unknown threats into known threats. I'm trying to remember the line, but I think Donald Rumsfeld was very well quoted for saying there are things that are known knowns, unknown knowns, or known unknowns, excuse me. So it's known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So things that we don't know, which seems to be the epitome of government, right? But there is some truth to what he's saying. There are things that we know, and we know that we know them. We know the depth to which we understand them. There are things that we know that we do not know. There are things that we are aware of our ignorance in. And then there are things that we are unaware of our ignorance of that we must still try to compensate for regardless of that ignorance. Okay? So by converting an unknown threat into a known threat, or by trying to by means of kind of framing an unknown by things that we do know, we're going to try and make proactive defense strategies possible. Now, I have listed a matrix here for threat intel categories based on long-term and short-term, and low-level and high-level. So the intersection of these four categories have provided four different categories that are independent of one another. So if something is considered to be long-term and low-level, it's a tactical threat. Information on TTPs tends to be an example, and it's consumed by service and SOC managers as well as admins. If it's long-term but high-level, we move from tactical to strategic. This is where we have high-level info on consistently changing risks, and it's consumed by high-level executives and management. Now moving into the short-term time frame, low-level stuff is considered technical. This is information on specific IOCs, so remember the indicators of compromise. This is going to be SOC staff as well as the incident response teams. If we take the short term and move it to high level, then we go from technical to operational, and this is info on a specific incoming attack. Like we know something's coming, this is what we know about it. And then we consume this information by means of security managers as well as the actual defense team. So if you go through kind of the infrastructure, it's like, okay, high-level executives would be interested in information that's long-term and high-level. Incident response teams being able to go back and be able to make changes based on known information about an attack. IR teams are going to be technical stuff, so that's short-term and low-level. So we see here that based on the time frame and based on the mission-critical nature of the threat, we can compartmentalize and say, this is information we need, this is who it needs to go to. Now, obviously, there are some gray areas in between, but this is a good starter category to start understanding how we break risk apart and how we turn an unknown threat into a known threat. Another way that we work with risk is what's called threat modeling. Now, this is a risk assessment approach for evaluation by capture, organization, and analysis of all relevant application data. And this is the process. Number one, we're going to identify our security objectives. When you say to somebody, how do you secure something? Well, people start spitballing ideas and they throw things out. The problem is it's not all the time, but a lot of the time, the stuff that's actually relevant to what you're working with is going to be very specific. So if you have all of these nebulous ideas, you're going to be exerting a huge amount of effort, but not actually yielding the premium, the result of that effort. Identifying our objectives means we can determine how much effort is required for each successive step in the process. We know where we're starting from, we know what our target is, and we know what we want to avoid, which is kind of important, removing extraneous information. The application overview is where we're going to identify components, we're going to identify data flows, and we're going to identify trust boundaries. Trust boundaries basically just mean at what point do we no longer have a valid trust model between an interior and exterior force? At what point does the data need to be verified by another party, etc.? At what point does that scope reach? Decomposing the application, which can be a little bit simpler than it's talking about. It's really breaking down the tasks of what it does. It's not necessarily decompiling it or reverse engineering it, though that sometimes can be involved for certain things. So we always want to be aware of that. The programming side of the house is not to be ignored when we're working as technicians. Excuse me. We will then use the information from the decomposition to identify threats relevant to the control scenario, as well as the context from steps 2 and 3. And then the last threat is to identify the vulnerability, which is where we say, okay, we have a weakness, we have a known exploit, let's go ahead and figure out how it fits into vulnerability categories. So we'll use things like CVE and CVSS to be able to benchmark the type of threats that are present in our systems. So when we use a threat identifier tool like OpenVOS, then that obviously will allow us to have a basis for comparison to say this particular system is showing threats of this rating, this is what we can do to fix it. So here we have a graphic representation of incident management, which is a set of defined processes to allow us to identify, analyze, prioritize, and resolve incidents as soon as possible. So we have vulnerability handling, artifact handling, announcements, alerts, incident handling, which has a bunch of subsets, and other management services. Incident handling and response, or IH&R, falls into 9 primary categories, 8 of which we have off to the left, the 9th on the right. Preparation, pretty self-explanatory. Incident recording and assignment, so we're categorizing. Incident triage, how bad is it? Notification, containment, evidence gathering, forensic analysis, eradication, and recovery. So from preparation to recovery, that is a complete cycle of the IH&R process, except we need to make sure that there is some post-mortem cleanup, if you will. After the incident is done, we have to do 5 main things. We have to document, which we should have been doing as we go along, and we talk about this in CEHv11, among other things. We have to make sure we're documenting. We need to have an impact assessment. We need to be able to review and revise policies, close the investigation, and then once we have figured out the proper audience and methodology, we're going to provide incident disclosure. So if we have anything public facing that we need to identify, we can then put it in as part of the incident disclosure. Artificial intelligence and machine learning in cybersecurity. These are indispensable tools due to the massive upswing of computing power, data collection, and aggregation capabilities. Not to mention the sheer volume of storage that we deal with. I believe I read an article last week talking about how now the human population has generated about 18 zettabytes of information. So, we have gigabytes, terabytes, then we get up to petabytes, exabytes, yottabytes, and then zettabytes. So we're several orders of magnitude away from what normal home storage would be. Machine learning is unsupervised and self-learning. It defines a baseline for the network or system and then can report deviation and anomalies in real time. So machine learning allows us to create a baseline saying that this is normal. Then we have things that happen that are outside of normal, and the machine learning system is able to respond very quickly and say, this is the response that I choose to give based on my existing instructions. AI and machine learning also helps us to identify new exploits and vulnerabilities as they emerge, which is much easier to analyze. Machine learning classification falls into 2 primary categories, supervised and unsupervised. Supervised learning is where we use labeled training data in order to help the emergent learning system figure out the differences between labels. Unsupervised learning is where we have unlabeled training data with the intention of deducing the categories independently. So we can see here from the graphic on the right, unsupervised learning deals with reduction of dimensionality, meaning that we're trying to lower the number of metrics being used to identify the data's usefulness. And then we have clustering, which allows us to find where bits of information are correlated, but not quite in the same way, that they're related so that we can find some dependencies. Supervised learning basically just says classification and regression. We're going to figure out where this data goes and then how we can predict data based on the existing trends. Cybersecurity is the 4th most active industry that deals with companies applying artificial intelligence. By 2024, so that's only 2 years from now, the market is set to exceed $300 billion. The AI-related market outside of cybersecurity is projected to be $38.2 billion by itself 2 years after that. So you can see that it's more than 10% of the industry within the next 4 years. Pretty huge amounts of information going on. So how do artificial intelligence and machine learning prevent cyber attacks? Well, I figured I'd throw up a couple of different categories here. Password protection and authentication, phishing prevention and detection, network security, AI-based antivirus, which deals with a lot of heuristics, so that's behavior-based detection, threat detection, anti-AI neutralization, fraud detection, vulnerability management, behavioral analytics, and botnet detection. Now this is an interesting one. So botnets traditionally tend to fox humans quite a bit when it comes to prevention because there is no predefined, this is the exact nature of a botnet. Botnets tend to have some habits that can be identified much further down the road, but due to the pattern seeking recognition and speed of a machine learning system or an AI system, it can do that much more quickly. So it'll be interesting to see as time goes on the endless competition between those who would use machine learning for nefarious purposes versus people who use it for defense. Now let's get into InfoSec legislation, acts and laws. This is our last section of the day. I talked about these guys a little bit earlier, so I'll revise. PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. This is a proprietary standard for InfoSec for organizations that process card information for major credit, debit, prepaid, ATM, and point-of-sale cards. This standard applies to all entities involved in the process, so merchants, processors, acquirers, issues, and service providers, as well as all others who store, process, or transmit this cardholder data. High-level overview falls into these 6 categories. Build and maintain a strong network, implement strong access controls, protect cardholder data, regularly monitor and test networks, maintain a vulnerability management program, and maintain an InfoSec policy. If you do not meet these requirements, as Target did not, it may lead to fines or termination of processing privileges. Imagine how much of a hit a company like Target would take if they suddenly had to go cash only. It'd be pretty ridiculous, right? So it's important to understand that the reason that we make sure that these big consensus-driven operations are present is so that companies do not use their largesse to essentially bypass the law. We're trying to make sure that regardless of whether or not you're a mom and pop shop over off of, Independence Boulevard, or you're a multinational corporation with assets in the hundreds of millions, you're still playing the same kind of ball. You're still, subject to the same level of scrutiny. ISO and IEC 27001:2013. So the 27001 was last revised for the purposes of this text in 2013 and specifies requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improving an InfoSec management system within an organization. Some suitable uses for this would be things like formulation of security requirements and objectives, ensuring that security risk management is cost effective, ensuring legal and regulatory compliance, defining new InfoSec management processes, ID and clarification of existing processes, determining the status of management activities, implementing business enabling InfoSec, as well as providing relevant information security data to customers. That last one is part of a trend that we're starting to see in higher levels of data transparency. You hear about a lot of people who are kind of getting fed up with the nature of credit cards and the semi-predatory nature of the credit system and things like that in general. There's a lot of legislation that's gaining some ground that is trying to prevent consumers from being taken basically over a barrel by credit card companies, because credit card companies by their very nature are trying to get people to spend beyond their means. The credit card system rewards you for having a revolving balance. It just needs to be below a certain amount. So it's an interesting prospect. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, originally of 1996. HIPAA deals with some administrative simplification statutes and some rules that we want to look at here. The Electronic Transaction and Code Set Standards. This made things a little bit better and a little bit worse in that there's a ton of codes that are out there to where you have, you have emergency coding for all kinds of things that seem like they would never be used. But that means that all providers that do business electronically in the health field have to use the same transaction codes, the code sets, as well as the identifiers. It just makes sure that there's a lot more efficiency in being able to translate what something is identified as, so that way something doesn't get misrepresented on someone's chart. Privacy rule gives federal protection for the personal health information of covered entities and gives an array of patient rights regarding that information. Security rule specifies administrative, physical, and technical safeguards that must be used to ensure that the CIA InfoSec triad is protected. National identifier requirements means that standard transactions must have nationally unique identifier numbers attached. So if you're a healthcare provider, if you are managing a healthcare plan, if you're an employer, you have to have a unique identifier number so that that way anything with your number on it can be easily traced throughout the entire system. The enforcement rule is going to provide standards for enforcing everything above. So sometimes it's going to be, you'll see this with a lot of legislation. This is what you're supposed to do, and at the very end you'll be like, oh, this is what happens if I don't do it. These are the background penalties. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, commonly abbreviated as SARBOX, was designed to protect investors by increasing the accuracy and transparency of corporate disclosures. Prior to that, legally, there was not a huge amount of information that was necessary to be disclosed to the public, unless it was something that would directly broach a lawsuit. So here we have 11 provisions. The PCAOB, which is the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which established independent oversight of public accounting, providing auditing services through accounting firms. So if there was a public accounting firm that handled a particular aspect of business, they had to be able to be audited externally. You couldn't just use internal auditing. Auditor independence, which is where standards were put in intending to limit conflict of interest as well as addressing partner rotation to keep people from creating what's called gross criminal malfeasance, essentially, to where they are trying to manipulate the numbers in order to conceal potential losses or to try and prevent people from cooking the books, as you were, as well as approval and reporting requirements. Title III, corporate responsibility, mandating that senior executives take individual responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of corporate financials. Enhanced financial disclosures describes new requirements for transactions, including off-balance sheet, pro forma, and corporate stock transactions for officers. Conflicts of interest for analysts. These were measures designed to restore investor confidence in the reporting of securities analysts who previously had engaged in activity that was considered to be unethical. Commission resources and authority to restore investor confidence again in security analysts. Studies and reports. These are effects of accountancy consolidation, the roles of credit agencies and securities, violations and enforcements, and the inquiry of breaches for companies like Tyco, Enron, Global Crossing, etc. Title VIII dealt with corporate and criminal fraud accountability, so describes specific penalties for alteration of records, investigation interference, and protection for whistleblowers. So if there was an accountancy firm that was making, again, less than ethical or less than legal transactions or committing acts that were considered to be outside the scope of SARBOX, a whistleblower would actually be given special protection to allow for this corporate accountability. White-collar penalty enhancement. This meant that things that are considered to be white-collar crimes, very, stroke of a pen kind of crimes, signing this form or that form, crimes of omission. Specifically, things like failure to certify a corporate report. So if we say that a corporate report goes out and it's got numbers that are not accurate, that would skew how the market would behave regarding investments in our company or how stockholders would behave. If we sent that out and it was false, and it was as simple as the CEO saying, oh, I'm sorry, that came across my desk and I hadn't had time to review it yet, now there's a penalty saying, well, you didn't review something and it got released, so you're on the hook. We've got to be able to keep you accountable. Corporate tax returns means that now the CEO of a particular company should sign the company tax return to identify that it has gone far enough up the chain that there is somebody who's actually had eyes on it that should take responsibility for it. And then Title 11, corporate fraud accountability. This identifies record and fraud tampering as offenses with specific penalties, and the Securities Commission can actually temporarily freeze large or unusual payments in order to prevent people from trying to manipulate money laundering through accountancy firms. DMCA and FSMA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act. there is an organizational law act that had two treaties in it that the U.S. used to develop DMCA. So the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, had these pieces in 1996, and the U.S. decided to copy them into their own standing Copyright Act. Defines legal prohibitions against circumvention of technological protection measures and against removal or alteration of copyright management information. So, if you were to rip a DVD or CD or things like that, there would actually be new penalties attached because it's a very specific type of crime under this new legislation. FISMA is the Federal Information Security Management Act, which provides a comprehensive framework for ensuring effective InfoSec controls over resources for federal operations and assets. This means we're going to include things like standards for guidance on categorization of assets based on their mission impact, minimum security requirements, selecting appropriate controls, assessing controls and their effectiveness, and the security authorization of access to those assets. Cyber law in other countries. I'm not going to read through all of this because it's exhausting. There's a ton of stuff in here. So what I have done is, this is direct from the EC Council site. You can see I've got the copyrights down on the bottom. You've got links to go to each one, so if you're curious about those various aspects, you'll see some of this in the text. But you can see that every major developed country has brought in at least some form of law to deal with different changes in technology. So things like in Belgium, they specifically developed a law about computer hacking. In the United Kingdom, they have stuff about the Computer Mouse Act, it was called the Mouse Act, but it's the Misuse Act, excuse me. You've got the Information Technology Act of India. Of course, India, a lot of people have the assumption that a lot of outsourcing and a lot of phone scamming and phishing goes through India, and it's because the technological infrastructure is there. But if these people get caught, they are subject to actually some pretty hefty fines. So it's a matter of, they're kind of weighing the cost-benefit analysis here. And that's the end of chapter 1. So a lot of material, one lecture covering almost an hour and a half. So hopefully you learned something. I hope that's the point. We will, of course, discuss some finer details when we get into class, and we will get into the labs for chapters 1 and 2, possibly 1, 2, and 3, because I don't think we have a lab specifically for chapter 1. So I hope you had fun, and if you have any comments, you can always contact me through my Google Voice number, which is posted on the syllabus in Blackboard. You can always contact me at my email, or you can leave a comment here on the YouTube channel. So until next time, guys, thank you so much as always for your time and attention, and I'll see you next class.